Now, just as an exercise, I would like to move a bit away from the canon and relate all this stuff very quickly to contemporary material, and especially two movies. One is the movie Arrival with Amy Adams. They're both science fiction movies, though I wouldn't call this movie Gravity on the left with Sandra Bullock a science fiction movie, but it's certainly in outer space. They both have women. Both women have daughters that have deceased, that are deceased, that have passed away, and in both movies, circularity plays an enormously important role. I'm starting with Arrival because it's so nice to see the octopus or the octopod on the left and the heptapod on the right. The heptapod writing its sentences. I'm not sure anybody of you actually saw the movie. It's quite beautifully done. These heptapods are aliens that enter with a beautiful spaceship. That in science fiction movies, normally either aliens land on Earth or they stay like really high in orbit. In this case, they land almost, so they stay like a number of feet above the Earth, and they generally hang vertically. There we go again. They hang vertically above the Earth. In there we have the heptapods that write. So this looks like a combination of Jackson Pollock and geometric art, but this is actually a sentence, and they write a sentence in one go. So from the first word to the final word of a sentence, they write that all at once. Actually, they write the first word and the last word first, and then they get to the middle to close the circle. And this is sort of the emblem of the movie, because instead of going through linear time, where you start like with a sentence and you go all the way to the end, where you've passed time from T1 to T2, you've actually passed through chronologically through time. You now get a circular model of time where beginning and end fit together, and that becomes sort of the model of the understanding of the central figure, which is Amy Adams, understanding the birth and death of her daughter. That circle relates to the circle on the left, which is a sort of the central moment in the movie titled Gravity with Sandra Bullock. And Sandra Bullock is in a space station with George Clooney, which gets hit by debris from a Russian satellite, and it's destroyed. And there's a whole crisis, of course, and they're in orbit. There it is, like, 200 miles above the Earth, sort of, looking down on the Earth, and there's this enormous crisis of how do we actually deal with this situation. George Clooney dies, of course, and Sandra Bullock finds a Russian space station to actually see if she can use that, the capsule of it, to actually return to Earth. And there's this moment in the movie where she's like floating in zero gravity, but it's clearly a fetal image where she's reborn. And why is that important? Because earlier we heard that she has a daughter that has passed away in her discussions, in her talks with George Clooney. And this is the moment of rebirth. So she's like floating in amniotic fluid. A very Art Nouveau image. And then the movie actually takes a turn. and then she lands on Earth at the end in water, and then she walks out of the water and she's reborn. So this is where these two movies intersect. Another very important moment in Arrival is where Amy Adams has entered the very core of the spaceship, and she actually meets the heptapod. Now the heptapod, this seems to be the creature at first. It's not. It's just like a hand of an enormously tall figure with a humongous chest. Not sure how that relates to Themos, and with a sort of head, and strangely enough in a vertical position. They're both in a vertical position, though they're both floating. Because in the middle of that spaceship, there's no gravity. There's just this sort of gas, quasi fluid, and because you can see them like quasi swimming through it. And these huge creatures. So this is the first time we actually see how tall the creatures are. And but there's this switch of there's this transformation of standing and floating again. Now we know that from the spaceship. If you've seen the movie, to enter the spaceship, you and not above the water as in the poster here, but actually when it's on land. And you can enter with a crane. You can enter the spaceship from the bottom. It opens up, and you're still in the vertical position, the vertical axis of gravity on Earth. And then, after you've entered the spaceship, like a number of feet into it, you have to take a turn. And gravity switches from vertical to horizontal. And there's a long corridor. And they actually walk in that corridor. Like seen from Earth, they would be walking like horizontally, not vertically, and they would be walking up. And then they enter a room where they then interact via a large window with the two heptapods. Abbott and Costello, they named them Abbott and Costello. It's not so important, but where you just see the heptapods, and then only later you get deeper into the spaceship where you see the whole figure. But this switch, this turning of gravity, going first vertically and then horizontally moving through, is just the most amazing thing. I mean, it's they're both a comment on gravity and time. Obviously, because how do you understand Arrival as a movie? It's the story is that there's this interaction with the alien figures, but that story is interspersed with Amy Adams constantly seeing flashes of how she interacts with her daughter, like from a very young age to the moment she actually dies of an incurable disease at the age of maybe 16 or 17. And she sees all that. So she even knows at a certain moment that the man she's going to have the baby with is actually the man she's with in the story. So she's like seeing her future. She's seeing her daughter being born, and she sees her daughter dying. And this then is connected to that circular image of the sentence where start and end connect. And this is what Nietzsche would call, or what the Stoics would call, the Roman Stoics would call amor fati. Is okay, you know there's a fate, there's something going to happen, but you accept it and you love it. So it's not that you love somebody and then that person dies and then you're in a state of horror and grief. Of course there's grief, but it doesn't lessen the notion of love. And that's the same for Sandra Bullock in the other movie. First, she's like depressed, and she's like fleeing in her work to forget about her much younger daughter. I think she was 4 years old when she died of a disease. And she's actually returning to Earth by accepting the death of her daughter. So that's, and you get, of course, here's the image of the poster of graffiti as a movie where you see Mother Earth and the umbilical cord, and I think in this case George Clooney being attached to it. So we get these two models of gravity relating to time, and then turning and becoming a circular model, which of course I would relate to the cycle of the three graces. It explains this sort of this Amy Adams naming her child Hannah, which is a palindrome, right? H-A-N-N-A-H, as a circular model. So both movies, I mean, not very far apart in time, just like 2 or 3 years when they came out, follow very, very similar models. This is where I would like to end the lecture. I just would like to say something about the third part, which we'll be recording soon, which will be related to this, but also an exploration of the notion of the gap. We talked about the gap and the figure. The gap is a very complex concept. In this case, I would call it the void, because it, in a book related to our research by Simone Weil, Gravity and Grace, a posthumous book by her, we will be discussing that and how she thinks about grace. We'll also be talking about the notion of the spectral, which I think is related to this empty chair, but also to the notion of transfiguration and flourishing or flowering. We talked a bit about flowers and how we actually see that gap in the work of Jacques Derrida and the spectre of Marx, and to a notion of spectralism and what Catholics call a real presence. So that will be the topic for the third part. Thank you very much.